Hey Unwrappers, Olly here. Just before we commence this week's proceedings, an opportunity to remind you, if you enjoy this show, you would likely also enjoy it in paper form. The Week magazine, delivered to your door each week, includes a selection of news, reviews and opinions from more than 200 UK and international sources for open-minded readers. And we've got a special offer for you podders. To get 6 free issues and a free Moleskine notebook, go to theweek.co.uk/offer and enter the promo code POD25. That's theweek.co.uk/offer and the promo code POD25. And now, on with the show. It's the week ending Saturday the 8th of August, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen a deadly explosion in Beirut, making 300,000 people homeless, President Trump permitting Microsoft to take over TikTok's American business, and the death of former SDLP leader John Hume, aged 83. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team, it is the return of Gabriel Power. The boss man, Holden Frith, is here as well. And from the Week Junior, editor Felicity, Capon. Holden, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Are you detaining me, Olly? Because if not, I'll exercise my right to proceed.
In the last week, we've seen a trend, an emergence, if you like, of groups of people, small groups, but nonetheless concerning groups who classify themselves as sovereign citizens, whatever that might mean, people who don't think the law applies to them. We've seen them at checkpoints, baiting police, not providing their name and address. On at least 3 or 4 occasions in the past week, we've had to smash the windows of people in cars and pull them out of there so they could provide their details because they weren't telling us where they were going. They weren't adhering to the Chief Health Officer guidelines. They weren't providing their name and their address.
Victoria Police Chief Commissioner Shane Patton at a press conference this week. Sovereign citizens, whatever that might mean, he said. Holden, what does it mean?
Yes, it's one of those terms that's actually quite difficult to define because it does mean different things to different people. But what unites them is a belief that they have a right to opt out either of specific laws, often around driving, or else the entire legal system by quoting some obscure statute that gives them privileges as an individual citizen. In its crudest form, though, it often involves people filming themselves refusing to respond to police officers and then posting those clips onto YouTube, which is what happened in this case.
I see. And so is it basically because of the internet that it's becoming a more widespread phenomenon? Because if you're filming yourself and uploading yourself, you're doing so for an audience. I guess in the past, people who believed in that kind of ideology were more siloed.
Yeah, it seems to have given it a particular boost at the moment as a combination of the internet and the coronavirus pandemic, which has both elevated the general sense of crisis and also given people a lot of new and to some people rather onerous laws that they can object to in a fairly safe way from within their cars at checkpoints. And so you get these points of friction between individuals and police that maybe haven't existed to the same volume previously.
Felicity, when you're talking about interactions with the police, the thing that's hanging over this conversation, obviously, is the death of George Floyd recently. And a lot of people will be thinking, well, in terms of stop and search, for example, it's reasonable to film yourself. In terms of if a police officer asks you to get out the vehicle, it's reasonable to ask why, because we've seen injustices elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the death of George Floyd is a huge part of this story. Now, there's a lot of anger and fury directed towards the police, particularly in the US, but you've also seen it in the UK, and this idea of defunding the police has become very pertinent. I agree with you that obviously, clearly with George Floyd and in other instances, there have been huge cases of overreach by the police. And of course, it would be completely justifiable for people to want to film incidences. And a lot of instances like George Floyd, we only know about because passerbys were filming them. But I think this is altogether a different kettle of fish. This is straying into all sorts of areas, more conspiracy theories. Some of them are quite weird and wacky and really just want to generally opt out of state institutions and the apparatus that kind of keeps everything functioning. So I think this is slightly different.
And Gabriel, what are some of those wacky things that sovereign citizens believe?
So in the US, at least, there are a number of sovereign citizens who believe that at some point in history, the American government set up by the founding fathers legal system that the sovereigns refer to as common law was secretly replaced by a new government system based on admiralty law, which is the law of the sea and international commerce. And under common law, they believe that sovereigns would be free men, and that under admiralty law, they are actually slaves. And then the ideas really go off the rails from there, and they believe all sorts of crazy stuff about how their name is actually a legal entity that's owned by the government or the crown or something, and it's very odd.
And Holden, some of it ties in as well originally with a vein of anti-Semitism too, doesn't it?
The movement seems to have started in the 1970s with a group called Posse Comitatus, who were a anti-Semitic, white supremacist, anti-government, pro-gun type group. It has become quite semi-detached from that. I think most of the people who are going around now filming themselves are either unaware or certainly aren't trying to evoke that particular ideology. But there is still a strong survivalist element to it, and definitely an anti-government element. So there's an overlap with some of that founding ideology.
And obviously the background at the moment, Felicity, of coronavirus is crucial here as well, isn't it? And that was what Shane Patton was talking about in that press conference. They were asking people to get out of the car so that they could put on their mask or whatever to keep themselves safe and keep the public safe, and they were refusing on that basis.
Yeah, absolutely. And in some instances, I feel under lockdown, you do have some sympathy with people being very frustrated that these new laws have been ushered in, often without any sort of parliamentary scrutiny or debate, especially under lockdown proper. Or it hasn't been laws, it's just been guidance and the sort of the blurred areas between those two. And people get very frustrated when it's not easy and it's not obvious about what the laws are and how to follow them. And there's been some great legal commentators on Twitter who themselves had their heads in their hands, scratching their heads, trying to work out what on earth it all means. And I think, especially when partial lockdown was reintroduced up north last week, there was something that said the rules have become official today, but not legal. And these legal commentators were still saying, what on earth does that mean? That feels very Orwellian to have official rules, but they're not legal yet. So I have some sympathy that when the law isn't clear, or whether it's guidance or you don't know what's going on, of course people get frustrated and there is this sort of angry backlash. What does it all mean and who's coming up with these things?
When we're being told things that contradict each other as guidance, Gabe, it's inevitable, isn't it, that people say we're going to have to just depend on our own wits. We're going to have to use common sense as to what's safe and what isn't safe. And I suppose in extremis, that leads to a denial of subjugation to authority. It's saying, I know better for my family than you do.
It does. The situation in Australia, it is quite complicated, but it seems that in some cases, health experts are siding with the sovereign citizen movement. So in Australia, sovereign citizens keep citing what's called the Victoria Charter of Human Rights. There was even a video of a woman giving a laminated copy of it to a police officer the other day as proof that she was right, which does state that every person lawfully within Victoria, which is the state obviously that Melbourne is in, has the right to move freely within Victoria and to enter and leave it, and has the freedom to choose where to live. But according to some government experts or some legal experts, new COVID-19 Omnibus Emergency Measures Act of 2020 suspended some of those rights, which it is legally allowed to do. But then Victoria's Chief Health Officer, Dr. Brett Sutton, has come out and not exactly helped matters by saying that police officers actually can't forbid people from leaving their houses, even if they have coronavirus, as it would violate their basic human rights. Felicity's right in that it seems to be a kind of war of interpretation rather than some sort of set legal infrastructure that can help people figure out what's going on.
I think that's exactly the sort of confusion and network of loopholes that this sort of idea feeds on. And one of the common tenements is this idea that there's a legal phrase that sovereign citizens can use to opt out of law. And it's often, are you detaining me? And the idea there is that unless the police have a good reason to detain you, they have to let you go. And you can see that there's good common sense behind that. And there is also some law behind it too, going back to habeas corpus, but also the idea that police can't just harass people and search people without having good reason to. And so I think, as I said, there are many clips of this sort of interactions posted to YouTube, and whether you sympathise with the police officer or the individual often can swing quite wildly depending on how each are behaving. In some cases, the police officer is being very unreasonable and seems to be aggressive, and the sovereign citizen is being relatively polite, and then you tend to see their point of view with it. But in other cases, they just seem to have chosen the smallest possible hill to die on and trying to be making things really, really inconvenient for someone who's just trying to do their job.
What are the solutions here, though, Felicity? Because if you're a government, how do you deal with the more extreme forms of libertarianism? How do you stop a movement that will call you authoritarian for trying to stop it? It's a sort of vicious circle, isn't it?
I think it's very hard, particularly under a pandemic. As Holden was saying, it's very fertile ground for these sort of weird and wacky theories. And just looking at the protests in Germany have really surprised me about people coming out in huge numbers to protest about government rules to do with coronavirus. I have some sympathy there. I think in this country, there's got to be better communication and clearer communication from the government in the first place, because I think this goes back to my point about there's a lot of fear, I think, especially to do with masks. People are very fearful. They don't want to wear masks because it makes them think of this deadly virus. And I don't think the communication from Number 10 has been good enough. And I also think local communication about local lockdowns, it needs to be clearer. So I think that would be my solution.
And I suppose as well, Gabe, that's where people who really subscribe to these kind of movements are recruiting from, isn't it? People who go online to research a fairly mainstream belief. I don't know, for example, that we were told not to wear masks to preserve workers on the NHS, even though it might have been better for our safety to have done so right from the beginning. And then they very quickly find themselves in a loop of this kind of disinformation.
In this scenario, in coronavirus, yeah, that is true. I'm sure it will be that they'll have gotten onto it from other kind of fringe news websites that doubt the efficacy of masks and things like that. Because in America, again, as an example, prior to coronavirus, one of the key recruitment tactics was somebody would have a massive tax bill, or they'd have a fine for parking or something. And so they'd go online to find like a quick fix for that. And then they'd go down like a rabbit hole of, oh, it actually turns out that you're not technically under the jurisdiction of the US government, and thus you don't have to pay taxes. And then that's how they get radicalized through there. I think what needs to happen is that the definition of sovereign citizen needs to be split up a bit. Because I feel like a lot of the people who are saying, oh, you're infringing upon my rights by not letting me go outside or making me wear a mask or whatever, they are less of a danger to society than like extremist sovereign citizens who the Southern Poverty Law Center have classed as an extremist group, and some sovereign citizens are on the FBI terrorist watch list. They can be really dangerous.
Yeah, so this is it, Holden. You've chosen this moment as your story of the week because we've seen a resurgence in the term. But what are the actual long-term implications, do you think? I suppose what it comes down to really at the moment is the sovereign state movement going to prolong COVID?
Or vice versa. And I think both could be true. And trust in government is one of the things that has suffered during the pandemic. And it feels that people are going to be more amenable to ideas that seem to give them more control of their situation. And I think that's one of the key things about all variants of the sovereign citizen movements, which definitely do cover a very wide spectrum, but all of them are in some way trying to regain control of a situation that they feel has slipped away from them.
Okay, Gabriel, you're up next after this. Okay, Gabe, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Is it time for Germany to say Auf Wiedersehen, Trump?
Germany, as you know, is very delinquent in their payments to NATO. And they're paying 1%, and they're supposed to be at 2%, and the 2% is very low. It should be much more than that. So they're delinquent of billions of dollars, and this is for years delinquent.
Okay, Gabriel, so we all know who that is. What was he talking about?
So last week, the administration of Donald Trump announced that the United States is about to, or is going to attempt to, cut back its deployments of troops in Germany by nearly 12,000, which is a significant withdrawal that may have quite far-reaching consequences in Europe. Currently, there are around 36,000 American troops stationed in Germany, which I feel like is something that not a huge number of people are actually aware of. Obviously, when you think of American foreign deployments, you think of Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. But yeah, this is something of a hangover from the Second World War, as Germany has been a vital part of the United States defense strategy in Europe since the end of that conflict. But recent rifts between Trump and the US and Germany over NATO payments has led to both sides seeming to reach an agreement where they feel like it's time to move away from relying on each other anymore.
And as you say, not all of us are that into our military history. We certainly know a fair bit about World War II, but might be surprised that so many American soldiers are still based in Germany. Why in the last 20 years has it been necessary? I understand in the 60s and 70s.
So it's been a continued strategy of NATO to keep American soldiers on European soil, obviously not on paper, but as a defense against Russia. the threat of Russia has grown over recent years. If you look at Crimea and you look at South Ossetia and Georgia, they have been more aggressive with foreign policy in recent years.
So, Felicity, that might seem an odd decision then. Russia's still a threat, so why pull troops out of the place that you've historically based people to face up against Russia? But then you look at where some of these troops are going, and some of them, which I'm sure plays very well into Trump's campaign, are going back to the USA. Others are going to Poland. You don't have to be a geographical expert to know that's closer to Russia.
Yeah, that was the point I picked up on. And actually, I'm slightly wondering whether the headline grabbing thing is Trump being quite petulant and having this bit of a problem with Merkel. But actually, if they're being redeployed strategically to Poland, if you are worried about Russian aggression, that actually makes more sense. If it's more of a sort of slight recalculating of how best and where US troops should be in Europe, then that doesn't seem like such a bad thing. And also just bearing in mind that under Obama, troops were pulled out of Germany. So this isn't the first time that it's happened. The US would keep some of its nuclear weapons in Germany, I believe, and some of its drones there. So I don't think this is as stark, perhaps, as some of the headlines would have you believe.
It's very stark, though, Holden, isn't it, for the German communities and towns around these army bases, in the same way it would be if we Brits were to pull out of Cyprus, for example. In those places, Americans form a huge part of the community.
Yeah, there's an economic impact to that, clearly, if you have a large number of people leaving, no longer spending money. But also, I would imagine quite a big cultural impact. One of the defining features of post-war stability in Germany, but across Europe really, has been the presence of the American security umbrella. And there have been various tensions over time about that. It is interesting that German politicians in particular seem very keen to keep American troops in their country. People may be a little more divided in themselves. You tend to associate the idea of removing a former army of occupation as being an immensely popular move, but in this case that really doesn't seem to be the case.
Yeah, there was a YouGov poll, Gabe, that said 55% of Germans believe European members of NATO should protect themselves from an attack without US help. Some saw that as evidence of an anti-American sentiment in Germany, but there's obviously more to it than that.
Absolutely. I think a lot of people have cottoned on to the fact that perhaps it is this economic benefit to certain towns and settlements around military bases that is the main reason that Germany have kept American citizens there. It probably would spark something of a diplomatic crisis had Germany turned around and many years ago been like, all Americans get out of here. In all honesty, in the current climate, it seems unlikely that Russia will attack Germany in a way that will require US ground troops. So it seems like they were being kept there just for the economic benefit. And for some reason, a lot of people, as you say, or a lot of news outlets have interpreted this as there being an anti-American sentiment, or that it's some sort of gift to Russia before Trump, loses the election in 2020, which one, doesn't make any sense because it will take years to remove all these troops. And two, although it might appear like Trump is doing Russia a favor, Russia is certainly not seeing it as that. As soon as Trump came out and said that he was removing troops, the Kremlin spokesperson told CNN, "We have never hidden the fact that we think the fewer American soldiers there are on the European continent, the calmer it is in Europe." They're certainly not playing nice if they do feel like America is doing them a favor.
In simple terms as well, it's just a question of how you phrase the question, isn't it? Should members of NATO protect themselves from an attack without US help? You can see why most people would think of their own powerful nation, yes, we don't need America. It's a very different question if there's been an attack than saying, should the Americans help you? Imagine the same people would say, yes, please.
I think also it probably ties in with Germany's history and the fact that it tends to stay out of anything aggressive on the global stage.
In recent times.
Yes, exactly.
There's a few notable exceptions.
And I wonder whether that sort of ties into it, whether there's a sort of frustration as well within some quarters of maybe outsourcing something to the US by keeping US troops in Germany. But I'm with Gabe. There's a lot of talk in the articles about Russian aggression, but obviously the nature of warfare has moved on so much that I can't see how troops on the ground in Germany, what that sort of does for Europe.
Holden, Gabriel mentioned Crimea. It's in very recent memories. Putin is poised to take advantage if he wants.
Yeah, and I think that calculation is playing into this, particularly in Germany, where it's the most powerful country in Europe, but it's very reluctant to wield that power, particularly when it comes to military power. It is uneasy about what's happening to its east, as well as there being an innate small c conservatism about all foreign policy, which would much rather have the equilibrium that exists, even if it is an imperfect one, than throw things up in the air and see where things land. I think Germany certainly wants to be able to maintain a business relationship with Russia, from which it buys a lot of gas and sells a lot of cars. It would rather maintain that with the US providing it, and NATO and the rest of the European defence forces, providing it a sense of certainty. I think the whole of Europe is trying to play that bargain in some ways. We all want to feel secure, but we all also want to try and keep the economy ticking over. We don't want to divert money into extra defence spending, particularly at the moment when health and economic recovery is really going to be the focus.
And what about Biden, Gabe? When it comes to the presidential election, what have the Democrats got to say about this?
Biden, in quite Trumpian fashion, has said that if he comes into power, he's going to reverse a lot of what Trump will have done on the global stage, including the decision to remove troops from Germany.
Is that a vote winner, Holden? Vote for me and I'll send more troops to Germany?
I don't think he's gone so far as to say he'd send more troops, just that he would review this decision and may well end up reversing it. I doubt it.
Okay, I understand there's political language,
Yeah.
but if troop brings men and women over back, he's then saying, I'm going to send them to Germany, isn't he? So that is what he's saying. I'm just curious how it plays in the States.
At the moment, I think Trump has got himself into a position where he's so unpopular that saying you'll do the opposite of Trump is by default quite a popular position, particularly with anyone who isn't already deeply committed to him. But I think in principle, the idea of sending American troops abroad is never really a vote winner in the States.
Yeah, I think that's the other thing worth saying, that we're on the doorstep of a US election. And I think the the reverse of a battle cry, but bring the troops home ahead of an election, it seems like something that could play out quite well. I feel with Biden, his strategy will be more of a rejection of Trump's whole America first, isolationism. Everyone on the global stage thinks we're a complete idiot thanks to Trump. And he will see himself as the diplomat, the easygoing guy who can strike up relationships with foreign leaders and get America back into a more reputable and powerful position on the global stage.
I'm now consulting my own internal glossary to work out what the reverse of a battle cry is. I can't think. Gabriel, what do you think this will do to relations between the US and the EU, if anything?
Overall, I think the EU is not going to take too much offence at Trump leaving because, obviously, as we said, moving troops to Poland and also Italy, and the US military will actually move its European headquarters from Stuttgart in Germany to Belgium. So a huge number of the troops will stay in the EU. It is interesting that prior to this decision by Trump, there was only one far left party in Germany that called for the removal of US troops. But now Trump has confirmed that he's going to do it. Suddenly everybody's having to rejig their policies on this in order to accommodate it. Like, for instance, Germany's defense minister, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, of the Christian Democratic Union, which is obviously Angela Merkel's party, said that while it was a pity that Trump was pulling troops from Germany, she said she wants to finally advance more quickly towards a common European security and defense policy. So it could mean less reliance on America.
Okay. Let's advance more quickly towards the end of the show. Felicity, you're up next after this. Okay, Felicity, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Is this a formal warning that the age of formal wear could be over?
First, relax. Style and fashion should enhance your life and not cause you more stress. Breathe. Meditate. Find something that works for you and helps to clear your head, and then everything will seem easier. A good white poplin shirt is something that every man should have a few of in his closet. I like the crispness of a white shirt worn with a dark suit. It always looks good, and somehow the pop of white makes me feel sharper.
Fashion designer Tom Ford's style rules in a video from Mr. Porter. Felicity, fashion is getting a dressing down.
Oh, very good. This was a story that caught my eye in Quartz, and it's primarily a US-focused story, but on August the 2nd, Tailored Brands filed for bankruptcy. Tailored Brands is a company which owns labels including Men's Warehouse and JOSA Bank, both of which sell men's suits in the US. And this is part of a trend over there. So Brooks Brothers, which is a 202-year-old menswear retailer that's dressed 40 US presidents, no less.
And supplied Olly Mann's wedding suit.
Ah, really? They've also claimed bankruptcy, and I think J. Crew is also in trouble. So it was look at whether, due to the pandemic or other factors, is the age of men wearing suits over, basically.
So it's a bit like the story you brought us a few weeks ago about working from home. Is this a blip or an irreversible long-term trend? You can see why it's happening. People are buying fewer suits because they're at home.
It does make sense. I think it's probably a little bit more complicated. I was trying to compare it to the UK, and actually it's really not a new thing. I don't think the pandemic can take all the blame for this. So I was reading an article in 1993, and even in 1993 they were saying that combined sales of ready-to-wear and made-to-measure suits had fallen 1.18 million in the first 3 months of that year. In 1989, 6.8 million suits were sold in Britain, and in 1993 that was down to 4.5 million. And more recently, 2019, Marks and Spencer's, which is the UK's biggest menswear retailer, said it was cutting back its formal wear range. So this predates the pandemic, and there are lots of things that you could read into that. The rise of casual days in the workplace, for example. Is it the rise of hot desking, where we all sit next to each other and there isn't that hierarchy? So I think lots more going on.
Holden, the boss man, there you are. I'm looking at you on your webcam wearing a red T-shirt. 30 years ago, you would be wearing a suit, wouldn't you? It has changed.
I guess 30 years ago, I wouldn't have been on a Zoom call recording a podcast from my bedroom. But yeah, I think journalism has always had its own slightly strange dress code. But certainly those sorts of hierarchies have broken down a lot. I think even in the 20 or so years I've been working, the number of suits you'd see generally in the office has declined. I've rarely had a job where I've had to wear suits, and I almost wish I had, because it feels as if it's an easier thing for men to be able to, you're using the suit as a uniform, which means you don't really have to think about what you're wearing every day. But I wonder if actually that is one of the things that has started to kill it off, in that it doesn't feel like a very individual mode of dress. There's not really much you can do with it. It is just a uniform.
From that point of view, Gabriel, is it a good or a bad thing that we're seeing this decline in formal menswear? Because if you're wearing more casual clothes, maybe you are more able to express yourself. And also, as we've discussed on the show before, there are other ways people can express themselves now digitally, for example, which aren't anything to do with what they're wearing.
I am absolutely on board with the decline in suits. I think I've worn maybe 2 in my life. I had a job where I needed to wear a suit every day, and it did make me wonder, why and who was it for? Especially when I'd rock up to the office and it would be empty. I'd be the only person there. And so I'd made all this effort to get dressed up, and then nobody was there to see it. So I'm all for the decline in formal wear in that regard.
Yeah, I agree, actually. I was reading a very interesting piece in Vox that was now saying that suits are actually the symbol of the powerless, and that whereas previously you might think of like Don Draper in Mad Men, people now wear suits in professions where you have to, you're wearing them for someone else, or interestingly, to say you're sorry. So there's been quite a lot made of Mark Zuckerberg, who will don a suit as a sort of visual statement of contrition when he's up in whatever congressional hearing he's up in. And there was a New York Times piece that also was very interested in the 4 chief executives of big tech: Jeff Bezos of Amazon, Mark Zuckerberg, Tim Cook of Apple, Sundar Pichai of Alphabet, who all did this congressional hearing wearing their suits, where actually, as we know, Silicon Valley, Zuckerberg was famous for wearing his hoodies, and it almost seems like you're more powerful if you can express yourself in your individuality and wear whatever the hell you want. So in some ways it does seem like perhaps a sort of shake up of ideas of masculinity and what successful men now look like.
And you can understand, can't you, Holden, why these big corporations who have hundreds of outlets now in brick and mortar stores that people aren't shopping in are struggling to keep up with this kind of trend, because what do people actually want? And in a sense, the fashion they are producing is slightly stuck in a rut as well.
Yeah, I read a piece in Vanity Fair, which is actually quite old now, but it was sort of suggesting that we'd seen very little innovation in the world of fashion or other areas of design. And I think in the 8 years that's accelerated, and then in the last 3 months of lockdown and beyond, it's accelerated even more. I mean, I know from my habits that I now buy exclusively online, and it's very easy to end up finding one company that makes t-shirts that fit you, one that makes trousers that fit you, and then I tend to just go back to those over and over again, and they take up an increasing portion of my wardrobe.
Suits also have gone out of fashion because I assume millennials have less spending power, and suits are quite expensive. So that will obviously be one of the reasons why people aren't wearing them as much. But the toll that coronavirus is taking on the fashion industry is pretty enormous. And it also is having knock-on effects in countries where a lot of the clothing is produced. So it really is a global problem at the moment.
Felicity, and this always happens when we talk about environmental things, it's sort of better for the planet, isn't it, if in the West we buy fewer clothes of any kind? But at the same time, obviously, that's bad in globalization terms. That's bad for people who work in countries where they're dependent on making stuff for us.
Yeah, and again, we've talked about this on the podcast a lot, the idea of fast fashion and sustainability and all that sort of thing. And I wonder how suits plays into that. I don't know whether if previously you would just have 2 or 3 suits in your wardrobe and that's what you lived your life in, and now if there is a massive boost and surge in being more individual and wearing clothes to express yourself for all sorts of different things, whether that would actually see an increase in people being more inventive and going to new shops and buying all sorts of different clothes.
I have to ask you, Holden, because I'm curious. You said that you buy all your stuff online. What was the last item of clothes that you bought and where from?
It was a T-shirt actually from an online store called Son of a Tailor, and they would very much fall into what that Vanity Fair article would consider a rut of fashion. They basically produce 1, maybe 2 items, lots of different colours. You just pick the colours, you go back.
Don't do yourself down, Holden. You're the Steve Jobs of Dennis.
It did him no harm.
You've got your look. Felicity?
I found a swimwear label that is sustainable and claims to make it swimwear from plastic pollution in the oceans. And I don't know whether this is true, but I'm hoping it is because I think that's brilliant.
Give them a name check. Do you remember what they're called?
Ava, A-V-A-A, swimmer.
Okay. And Gabe?
Socks.
Have you been off swimming?
Socks.
Where from?
Uniqlo.
My most recent purchase was also from Uniqlo, and it was some pants. On which bombshell, I think it is probably reasonable to end this episode of The Week Unwrapped. A big thank you to our always on-trend team of Felicity, Holden and Gabriel. Now, there is nothing wrong with recycling old favourites, as you'll discover if you seek out The Week Unwrapped's back catalogue. You can download every episode right now. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producers Lauren Armstrong-Carter and Sarah Miles at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.